It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. With the ongoing global pandemic, a supply chain crisis, and a rise in prices of materials, economies around the world are recovering slower than hoped. The Korean economy is also recovering modestly as exports and investments have been limited by the weak global environment. There are also troubles at home as rising levels of household debt and inequality threaten the strength of economic growth in the long run. We discuss these issues and more with Pareliussen, an economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I believe you're in South Korea right now in the central city of Sejong. How are you today?
Yes, I'm fine, a bit jet lagged and quarantining until I get my test result. But other than that, everything's good. Thank you.
Right, it's great to have you on our show. And well, what's been making headlines recently is South Korea's level of household debt. Now, that's also provided the backdrop for the Netflix hit series Squid Game, as you might know. And household debt in South Korea is actually growing at the fastest rate out of all 38 OECD countries. And it's in fact reached the point where debt now exceeds more than double the net household disposable income. What do you see as the fundamental problem?
Well, it has to do fundamentally with the housing market, and falling interest rates combined with the shortage of dwellings led to rising prices, and this leads to higher debt. And this is common to many OECD countries. But at the same time, households have boosted their assets, and fewer are behind on their loans than before the crisis. Banks have fairly strong buffers, much thanks to lending regulations, which are among the strictest in the OECD. So this said, it is a concern when debt is high and growing fast. It is one of the main vulnerabilities we see to economic growth in Korea. But the risk is when people buy houses because they expect prices to continue rising. And in this case, a shift in sentiment can lead to a correction, which can be difficult for people, and it can reduce economic growth as people become more careful with their spending.
And you're right, there has been so much nervousness around housing prices, which have been shooting up at incredible rates. And while the current government, it's drawn up, in fact, at least 24 measures to curb these housing prices, which is, of course, as you pointed out, strongly associated with household debt. But these measures have failed to work. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think after massive house building in the early 90s, policy has much more focused on taming housing demand. For example, by putting limits to how much people can borrow as a share of the house value and as a share of their income. And these regulations are now among the toughest in the OECD. So going forward, I think it's important to focus on how you can increase supply, how you can build more. But even though the government takes this seriously, it takes time. Price tensions are likely to remain for a period, but they should be contained by continued financial regulations, what we call macroprudential measures. And also, I think there's a discussion about monetary policy. When the Bank of Korea has started raising rates to respond partially to housing prices and household debt, I think it may be a good idea to signal that rates will not stay low forever, but it's also important that this reason does not come in the way of price stability, which is the main goal of monetary policy.
Right, and well, many countries have gone to near zero rates, and well, right now, compared to the global financial crisis when most countries thought austerity was the answer, many OECD nations have actually implemented massive stimulus plans to keep their economies afloat during the course of this pandemic and also build back better. But of course, someone needs to pay the bill. Do you think the taxpayer should be worried?
I think it's always good to worry a little bit, but I don't think the taxpayer should worry too much about that right now, because right now we have a pandemic we need to get out of, and massive stimulus was the right medicine to reduce the permanent economic damage from this pandemic. And this medication needs to continue until the patient is up and running and paying taxes, you know. And Korea is in a really good state, with public debt well below half of GDP, which is very favorable compared to most OECD countries.
And well, your organisation has quite a number of rankings, really. And well, South Korea tends to be on one either end of extremes when it comes to those rankings, not all of them good. And while the country has the fastest ageing society in the world, with the lowest birth rates of less than 0.9 children born per woman, so not even one child, and while the least productive work hours also according to your organisation, and while the list goes on. So it's clear that we're facing this productivity time bomb here in South Korea. How is this going to affect the country's economic growth in the long run?
I think the situation with aging is very serious. And you are right that increasing productivity, which means producing more for less, is part of the solution. But it's not enough. You need people to do the jobs, as an increasing share of your population retire, and they need health services, they need old age care. And you have the people to do these jobs, but you don't use them. You have Korean women, they are forced to choose between having a family and having a career. So this is about attitudes towards women and gender roles. It's about long working days. Again, productivity, efficient working time. It's about the unhealthy competition to get your children into the best universities. And in this situation, who can afford to have more than one child? So I think the day that Korean women can realistically combine a full-time job with having 2 or even 3 children, that day you won't have an aging problem anymore. And this is not a women's issue. It's not a women's fight. It's an issue for all. It's an issue for the economy. It's an issue for men who care about their wives, care about their children, and would probably appreciate spending more time with them.
And well, it's clear that the focus should be on achieving balanced growth. I mean, it's undeniable that South Korea did see a amazing rate of growth over the last few decades. But while right now we have a very high level of relative poverty, the 4th in the world, following Costa Rica, the United States, and Israel, according to the OECD. And well, how do these so-called advanced economies have such large disparities when it comes to income?
What these countries have in common is that they have a large dispersion of earnings, of wages, and this reflects, at least to an extent, that there's a large dispersion of productivity between firms. So high productivity firms, they pay more, like the chaebol here in Korea, and the low productivity firms pay less. Another thing these countries have in common is that they redistribute relatively little. So stronger social transfers reduce inequality in many, especially in European countries, quite strongly. But they need to be financed. So these countries also tax more. And the tax take is relatively low in Korea, so you could say that it's possible to redistribute more, but it's of course not a very popular policy.
Well, what would you recommend further in order for the country, South Korea that is, to see balanced economic growth?
Apart from gender equality and shared productivity across the economy, Korea needs to speed up its green transition. You have set tough targets, but you have also shown in the past that you can reinvent yourself. You can reduce your own emissions and you can export your solutions to the world. But this is not something the government can fix by increasing spending. You need to give businesses a good reason to develop zero carbon solutions, and you need to give people a good reason to save energy and go green. And how do you do that? Well, you make it cheaper to be green, and you make it more expensive to pollute. And the good news is that you already have a very good instrument in place to make this happen. You have an up and running emissions trading scheme that can take you there. It needs to be fine-tuned, the cap needs to be tightened, and fewer allowances needs to be given to businesses for free. This is to give the right incentive to propel these businesses into inventing the solutions and implementing them.
Right, so well, we did see a very ambitious plan by the government to take us into a greener future, and hopefully it will be able to implement the kind of helpful nudges that businesses need in order to get to that future. And well, amid geopolitical conflicts, the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, and the ongoing supply chain crisis, how should South Korea, which is so dependent on exports, really safeguard itself against external uncertainties as well as trade disruptions?
As you say, Korea is an export-oriented economy, so the answer is really simple. What you need to continue the miracle on the Han River is more openness, more cooperation, and more multilateralism. And the OECD is, of course, always ready to support in this. So this is the more robust strategy: diversify globally and do not isolate, go towards isolation.
Well, that is a worrying trend that we're actually seeing around the world. Economies becoming a little more protectionist, and well, that's one of the concerns that this country is facing, I suppose, with us being so trade dependent. But well, in terms of going forward, what are your projections for South Korea's GDP growth next year? Which areas are you particularly optimistic about, to end this interview on a lighter note?
Yeah, well, Korea is doing well, and we will publish a new forecast the 1st of December. So I cannot share our exact forecast, but I can say that our assessment has not changed that much since our last projection, which was that the growth will be 4% in 2021 and around 3% next year. And of course, the rapid vaccination campaign is a huge success and a key driver of your positive outlook. And we see consumption strengthening, and that's what drives the rebound as restrictions are lifted and you move towards the containment strategy to a living with COVID strategy. I think there can be some bumps in the road, especially during the winter season when COVID spreads more easily, despite high rates of vaccination. But the direction of travel is clear. It's towards more vaccination, more immunity, less restrictions, and more growth.
And just before we go, you've seen the explosive popularity of Korean cultural content such as the Netflix series Squid Game or K-pop band BTS. Do you see a potential future? Do you see a potential for Korean cultural content as perhaps one of its new sort of export areas?
Well, I think you are already there, and you can only go stronger. My girls, they love BTS, and I'm a huge fan of Squid Game, so I think you do a lot of promising stuff, and I'm sure we'll see. I'm looking forward to the next season and a lot of more Korean content going forward.
Right, well, there are many structural problems that South Korea needs to deal with, but hopefully we can look to a brighter future and a faster than expected recovery. Fingers crossed there. And well, thank you so much for your time today. That was Jon Pareliussen, an economist at the OECD. Thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you.